It's now fall, the time when our gardens are winding down and we are gathering the last of our harvest. You know, gardens can be a place to meet God as we meditate on the themes of furrowed rows, planted seeds, persistent weeding, regular watering, and bountiful harvests. They're all helpful analogies for the spiritual life. This week, the 27th Sunday in Ordinary Time, we will see this theme of gardens and vineyards as images of our relationship with God. So take a moment to review the readings before we begin. From the opening scenes of the Bible, God is presented to us as a divine gardener. Not once, but twice in Genesis 2, we're told it was God who planted the Garden of Eden. The call of our first parents was to cultivate and keep the garden, Genesis 2:15. That term cultivate is where we get words like cult and culture from. It's a worship word. The garden was the meeting place of God and humanity, and it's a symbol of the sacred spaces we should have in our life for meeting the Lord, and a reminder of the vigilance to keep those spaces, that is, to protect that place as essential to spiritual growth and free from enemies to that growth. It can be the garden of our heart, a room in our home, any place in time that we set apart for worship and communion. In our first reading, Isaiah the prophet picks up on that idea of God as a gardener. He speaks of his friend, Yahweh, as a conscientious and careful gardener. God went to great lengths to create an ideal vineyard, and yet his vines, the people of Israel, produced a bitter harvest, wild grapes. Their radical rejection of God's covenant care led to their ruin and exile in Babylon. Affection has to be reciprocated, and relationships must always include the principle of freedom for love to flourish. God will not force our wills, but he allows us to experience the consequences of our actions. The psalmist is going to join the prophet in unfolding that same theme in our responsorial Psalm 80. Israel is the Lord's precious plant, plucked from Egypt's grasp and planted in the promised land. It's the story of the Exodus. But like our first parents, Israel had to cultivate and keep the promised land as a sacred space of communion with God. But instead they let this new garden of God fall into ruin through their indifference or their resistance to God's offer of life and love, and they find themselves now exiled in Babylon. So Isaiah and the prophet beg the Lord to restore the vineyards of God's people again. Give us new life, and we will call upon your name. Restore us, for it is your face, like the sun beaming a garden, that will shine upon us, and through that glance we will be saved. The examples in these passages are dramatic, to be sure, but a clear-eyed look at the state of our own soul will find dry patches, choking weeds, inattention to our spiritual garden. Like our first parents, we must be vigilant to daily cultivate and keep our spiritual lives. Anyone who has a garden or a yard knows that just a few days of inattention can leave us gobsmacked when we discover the weeds or destructive bugs that can devastate those unattended spaces. The gospel gives us another agricultural parable that keeps this same theme, where Jesus uses symbolic language of parable to create a word picture of God's long history of being a gardener. Here the Lord is a landowner who's entrusted the care of his garden to tenants, the religious leaders of the Old Testament and the New Testament with Jesus. They all fail miserably and even kill the servants that God sends to help them cultivate and keep their spiritual lives, the prophets. And even when he sends his own son, they will kill him. Do you see a pattern here? Every generation has a choice to cultivate and keep the gifts given, or to experience the painful and pruning consequences of rejecting God's love. So all of these readings are a wake-up call to us in our generation. Are we cultivating and keeping what the Lord has given us? Are we bearing the fruit of the Spirit? Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, faithfulness, and self-control? In our second reading from Philippians, St. Paul will give us some gardening tips to safeguard the seed so lovingly planted by the Lord in our life. Here the apostle implores us to guard our hearts and minds. That's guard language akin to cultivate and keep. What are the characteristics that can act like fortified walls around a tender vineyard? Specific ways of thinking that are transformed into actions. This is what Paul says. Whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is gracious, if there's anything excellent, if there's anything worthy of praise, think about these things. Keep on doing what you've learned and received and heard and seen in me, says the apostle, and then the God of peace will be with you. Those kind of thoughts are like a fortified wall around your heart, around the garden of your spiritual life. It's no accident that best gardeners spend a lot of time on their knees, because it's also true of spiritual gardeners. Take some time this week on your knees in penetrating prayer and review the rows of your spiritual life. Ask the Lord to help you to root out anything that's choking life, to give attention to neglected spaces in the garden of your heart, and then trust in His loving providence to bring a harvest of spiritual fruitfulness to your lives.